Ethan Caldwell stepped out of the sleek black town car, the hum of New York City wrapping around him like a familiar song. The city pulsed with life, couples hand in hand, professionals rushing toward late-night meetings, street vendors pushing carts heavy with roasted chestnuts and hot pretzels. He adjusted the cuff of his tailored coat, glancing at the towering glass facade of Caldwell Industries, his empire. The company bore his name, a symbol of the success he had built from nothing. Real estate deals, billion-dollar investments, and luxury developments that reshaped skylines. He had mastered them all. Yet, as he stood beneath the golden lights reflecting off the building, an emptiness gnawed at him, an ache he refused to acknowledge. A valet rushed forward to take his car door, murmuring a respectful, "Good evening, Mr. Caldwell." Ethan barely nodded in return. That was the way it always was. People respected him, feared him even, but no one really knew him. Inside, the lobby of the Caldwell Tower was immaculate. Sleek marble floors, walls lined with modern art, the scent of expensive cologne hanging in the air. People in elegant suits moved with purpose, discussing mergers and acquisitions over glasses of imported whiskey in the rooftop lounge. This was his world. Yet lately it felt suffocating. A voice interrupted his thoughts. "Ethan, you made it." He turned to see James Kensington, his longtime business rival, approaching with a smirk that barely concealed his disdain. The man had been circling a lucrative midtown development deal Ethan had set his sights on, and tonight's investor dinner was another round in their silent battle. Ethan forced a smile. "James?" "Big night for you, isn't it?" James drawled, accepting a tumbler of bourbon from a passing server. "Rumor is you'll be announcing your next expansion. What's next? Buying the entire city?" Ethan took a sip of his scotch, letting the liquid burn its way down his throat. "I don't buy what isn't worth owning." James chuckled, shaking his head. "Still playing the lone wolf, Caldwell? You know, at some point, all that success starts feeling empty." Ethan stiffened. He wouldn't let the bastard know that, on some level, the words hit home. He spent the next hour shaking hands with billionaires and power players, closing deals with the smooth efficiency that had made him a legend. When the event finally ended, he slipped into the backseat of his car, exhaling as he loosened his tie. "Home, Mr. Caldwell?" his driver asked. Ethan hesitated. "Number, take me the long way." The city passed by in a blur of neon and headlights. From the tinted windows he watched life unfold, families laughing over late-night dinners, lovers wrapped in whispered conversations on park benches, people who had something real. He had everything money could buy: private jets, a penthouse overlooking Central Park, a team of lawyers and advisors who made problems disappear. But none of it meant anything when he woke up alone, the silence of his vast home pressing against him like a weight. He knew why he lived this way. Wealth made him a target. People wanted something from him: access, security, influence. Women were drawn to his power, not to him. It had happened before. It would happen again. Better to keep everyone at a distance. The car slowed at a red light near Bryant Park, the streets quieter this late at night. Ethan glanced outside and froze. A woman sat on the sidewalk, huddled against the freezing wind. A pair of small children curled beside her, their tiny bodies wrapped in oversized coats that barely offered warmth. One of them whimpered, rubbing her eyes with a small, dirt-streaked hand. Ethan's pulse kicked up. He didn't know why he was staring, why he couldn't look away. Something about the way the woman held the children, the way her shoulders curled protectively over them. Something about her felt familiar. His stomach tightened. Number it couldn't be. The woman lifted her face slightly as she murmured something to the child. Even beneath the grime, even through the hollowed-out exhaustion in her features, Ethan knew that face. Isabel Monroe. The air left his lungs in a rush. She had been untouchable once. The bright, ambitious girl at Columbia University, always one step ahead of him, always just out of reach. He had watched her from afar, too tongue-tied to approach her, too poor and invisible to be worthy of her world. She had been beautiful, full of life, with a smile that could level a room. But now she was here, on the street, her hair tangled, her once bright eyes haunted and hollow. The Isabel Munro he had known had never looked twice at him, but the woman sitting on the cold pavement, clutching 2 children to her chest, had nowhere left to turn. Ethan's jaw clenched. He didn't believe in fate, but this moment, felt like something he couldn't walk away from. The light turned green. The car inched forward. Ethan made a decision before he could think twice. "Stop the car." His driver hesitated. "Sir?" "I said stop the damn car." The tires came to a halt. Ethan pushed open the door and stepped into the night, the cold biting at his skin. Isabel hadn't noticed him yet. She was focused on the child in her lap, running gentle fingers over her tangled hair. Ethan took a step closer, his pulse hammering. "Isabel?" She froze. Slowly, almost fearfully, she lifted her head. And when her eyes met his, the shock and shame in them struck him like a blow. "Ethan," she whispered. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Isabel did the one thing he never expected. She looked away and pulled her children closer, as if bracing for the inevitable. The sharp winter air wrapped around them, but Ethan barely felt the cold. His pulse thundered as he stared at Isabel Munro, the woman who had once seemed untouchable, the woman who had existed in his memories as light and promise, now reduced to a ghost of herself. She wouldn't meet his eyes. Instead, she clutched the 2 small children closer, pulling them into her frail embrace as if shielding them from him. Ethan took a slow step forward. "Isabel?" She stiffened. For a long, painful second, she said nothing. Then, in a voice so hoarse it barely carried over the city's hum, she whispered, "Go away, Ethan." The words hit harder than they should have. Go away? That was it? She wasn't going to acknowledge the years, the drastic shift in circumstance? She wasn't going to explain why she, of all people, was here, sitting on the pavement with 2 tiny children huddled against her? Ethan exhaled sharply, forcing himself to remain calm. "I don't think I can do that." Isabel finally looked at him then, and for the first time, he saw what the years had done to her. The fire that had once burned in her dark eyes had dimmed, replaced by something hollow, something broken. But beneath the exhaustion, the weight of whatever she had endured, she was still Isabel. And something deep inside him, something long buried, refused to turn away. One of the little girls stirred, rubbing at her eyes with a tiny, dirt-smudged hand. "Mommy, I'm cold," she whispered. Isabel immediately pulled her closer, whispering soft reassurances. The tenderness in her voice made something twist in Ethan's chest. "Mommy." He looked between the 2 girls, both barely older than 4, bundled in coats that were too thin for the brutal winter air. Their shoes were worn down, their cheeks pale from the cold. Ethan clenched his jaw. Number he wasn't leaving them here. "Isabel," he said, his voice firm, "you need to come with me." Her lips parted slightly, as if the suggestion was too shocking to comprehend. Then she shook her head violently. "No. You can't stay here. I have no choice." Her voice cracked on the last word. Ethan crouched down to her level, ignoring the way the pavement's chill seeped through his expensive slacks. He held her gaze steady and unwavering. "Yes, you do." Isabel bit her lip, struggling to steady her breathing. Pride. It was always her pride. Even now, even in this state, she was trying to hold on to whatever dignity she had left. But the little girl shivered again, and Ethan saw the moment Isabel broke. Her shoulders sagged, her eyes darting toward the children before closing in defeat. "Okay," she whispered, "just for tonight." Ethan didn't wait for her to change her mind. He pulled out his phone. "I need the car back here, now." His driver responded immediately, and within moments the sleek black Mercedes glided to a stop by the curb. Isabel hesitated, staring at the vehicle as if it were a trap she was walking into. Ethan reached out a hand. "Come on." She didn't take it. Instead, she picked up one of the girls in her arms, shifting her weight as if bracing herself for a fight. The other twin stood frozen, her small fingers gripping the hem of Isabel's coat. She looked up at Ethan with wide, frightened eyes. She was scared of him. Ethan swallowed hard, then crouched down again, softening his voice. "What's your name, sweetheart?" The girl hesitated, glancing at her mother. Then, barely above a whisper, she murmured, "Harper." Ethan offered a small smile. "Hi, Harper. I'm Ethan. Is it okay if I carry you to the car?" Harper looked at Isabel, waiting for her approval. Isabel, after a long pause, nodded. "It's okay, baby. He's a friend." It wasn't much, but it was enough. Harper hesitated before finally lifting her arms. Ethan carefully picked her up, stunned by how light she was. Too light. His chest tightened. How long had they been like this? As the driver opened the door, Ethan slid into the back seat, settling Harper beside him while Isabel got in with the other twin. The moment the doors shut, the heat wrapped around them, a stark contrast to the freezing city air. The little girls immediately huddled closer to their mother, soaking in the warmth. Isabel sat stiffly, her arms wound tightly around them, her gaze fixed on the city lights outside the window. Ethan watched her in silence. She was embarrassed, humiliated. He could see it in the way she refused to meet his eyes, in the way she clenched her jaw as if willing herself not to cry. He had 1,000 questions. How had this happened? Where was her family? Who had abandoned her? But tonight wasn't about getting answers. Tonight was about getting them somewhere safe. "Where are we going?" Isabel finally asked, her voice small. "My place." She flinched at that. "Number I just need a motel or—" "No." His voice was firm, leaving no room for argument. "You need a warm bed, a real meal, somewhere safe for them." He gestured to the twins, now barely awake. "I have all of that." Isabel didn't fight him. She didn't agree either. Instead, she closed her eyes, pressing a soft kiss to Hazel's forehead as the little girl drifted off in her lap. Ethan exhaled, his grip tightening slightly on his knee. This wasn't charity. This wasn't pity. This was Isabel Monroe. And for the first time in years, she needed him. The Mercedes glided through the quiet, well-lit streets of the Upper East Side, leaving behind the chaos of the city. Isabel sat rigidly in the back seat, her arms wrapped tightly around Hazel, who had fallen into an exhausted sleep. On the other side, Harper rested against Ethan's side, her tiny fingers curling into his coat like a kitten clinging to warmth. The unconscious trust of a child. Ethan swallowed hard, adjusting his hold on her. It had been years since anyone had leaned on him so freely. The weight of her small body against him, the rhythmic rise and fall of her breath, stirred something he hadn't felt in a long time: responsibility. Isabel, however, wasn't as easy to reach. She stared out the window, her reflection a ghost against the glass. Ethan knew that look, pride battling survival. He didn't speak, not yet. He didn't want to scare her more than she already was. The car pulled into the underground garage of the Caldwell penthouse, a private entrance allowing them to avoid prying eyes. Isabel barely glanced at the luxury surrounding them. Glossy marble floors, imported Italian lighting, and the sleek black and gold accents that made up his world. Ethan stepped out first, shifting Harper in his arms. The little girl made a small sound but didn't wake. Isabel hesitated before following, adjusting Hazel on her hip. She hesitated at the elevator doors. "Ethan, this is too much." "It's a warm bed," he said simply, pressing the button. "That's all." Her jaw tightened, but she stepped inside. When the doors slid open at the top floor, Isabel's breath hitched. The penthouse was more than just expensive, it was designed to be a statement. Floor-to-ceiling windows stretched across the entire back wall, offering a breathtaking view of Central Park, the city twinkling beneath the night sky. Everything was sleek, modern, and impossibly pristine. It was the kind of home that screamed power and solitude. And Isabel didn't belong here. Her grip on Hazel tightened. "Ethan, I can't stay here." He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "You can, and you will." Before she could argue, a soft voice interrupted. "Mr. Caldwell?" Isabel stiffened. From the hallway, Martha Sinclair, Ethan's housekeeper, stood in her usual navy cardigan and pearls, her sharp eyes immediately assessing the situation. She had been with Ethan for over a decade, and nothing got past her. She took one look at the half-frozen woman clutching two sleeping children, and her expression softened. "Oh my," she murmured. "Let's get them settled, shall we?" Ethan didn't have to say a word. Martha stepped forward and, in one swift motion, lifted Harper from his arms. "Come along, sweetheart." The little girl barely stirred as Martha carried her down the hall toward one of the guest rooms. Isabel stood frozen. Ethan motioned toward the hallway. "Come on." She followed hesitantly, her feet moving slowly over the plush white carpet. When they reached the guest suite, Isabel hesitated again at the doorway. The room was bigger than most apartments, a king-sized bed with crisp white sheets, a private bathroom, and floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city skyline. The lighting was soft and warm, and a fireplace crackled in the corner, radiating heat. To Ethan, this was just another spare room. To Isabel, it was too much. He saw it in the way she gripped Hazel closer, in the way her eyes darted to the massive bed, the silk curtains, the faint scent of lavender from the linens. She was used to cold pavement and hard concrete, not this. Ethan sighed. "It's just a room, Isabel." She let out a shaky breath. "For one night. For as long as you need." She didn't argue again. She couldn't. Carefully, she laid Hazel down next to Harper, tucking the blankets around their small bodies. The moment the warmth enveloped them, both girls melted into the bed, their faces relaxing for the first time that night. Isabel just stood there, staring at them. Ethan stepped closer, keeping his voice low. When was the last time they slept somewhere? The room was silent except for the crackling of the fireplace. Isabel stood at the edge of the massive bed, her gaze fixed on her daughters, who were now nestled beneath layers of warmth they hadn't known in too long. Harper let out a soft sigh in her sleep, curling into Hazel, their tiny hands intertwined. Ethan leaned against the doorframe, watching Isabel struggle against herself. Her fingers twitched at her sides, as if she was fighting the urge to tuck the blankets tighter or reassure herself that this moment, this warmth, was real. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. "You can rest now." Isabel's shoulders tensed. "I don't—" She stopped herself, shaking her head. "I don't want them to get used to this." Ethan's brows drew together. "To what?" She turned to face him. "This kind of comfort, this life. Because it isn't ours." He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Isabel, you have nowhere to go. You know that." "I'll figure it out," Ethan scoffed. Like hell you will. She flinched at his tone and regret shot through him. He had never meant to sound harsh, but the thought of her dragging those little girls back onto the streets lit something angry and protective inside him. He softened his voice. I'm not asking you to stay here forever, but I'm not letting you leave tomorrow either. Her eyes burned with pride. Why are you doing this? Ethan could have given her a dozen logical answers, but none of them were the truth. Instead, he said the one thing that mattered. Because I can. Her jaw clenched, but she didn't argue. She looked at the twins again, then back at Ethan. I'll sleep on the floor. Ethan's brow furrowed in confusion before he let out a low, disbelieving laugh. Isabel, there's a king-sized bed in front of you. She crossed her arms. It's your house. I won't take advantage of your generosity. Ethan shook his head, exasperated. You're impossible. Before she could protest, Martha appeared in the doorway, holding a folded blanket and a steaming cup of tea. Oh, for heaven's sake, Martha muttered, her tone somewhere between fondness and frustration. There's an entire guest wing, and you think Mr. Caldwell is going to let you sleep on the floor? Isabel hesitated. Martha stepped closer, pressing the blanket into her arms. I know you don't trust this yet, but you will. In the meantime, drink this and rest. Isabel swallowed, her throat working around emotions Ethan could tell she didn't want to show. She finally accepted the tea. Thank you. Martha gave a small nod, then turned back toward Ethan, her sharp eyes flicking over him in silent assessment. You too, Mr. Caldwell. Get some rest. Ethan smirked. Is that an order? Martha gave him the same look she always did when he ignored his well-being. What do you think? With that, she left. Ethan turned back to Isabel. You don't have to be afraid of accepting help, you know. She let out a hollow laugh. I learned a long time ago that help always comes with a price. Ethan's expression darkened. Who had taught her that? She must have seen the question forming on his face because she quickly turned toward the bed. Good night, Ethan. It wasn't a dismissal, but it was the closest thing she could give him. Ethan lingered for a moment before nodding. Good night, Isabel. Then, without another word, he walked away. Ethan couldn't sleep. He paced his office, staring out at the city skyline, but his mind wasn't on business deals or stock markets. It was stuck on the woman down the hall, curled into herself, clutching pride like a shield against the life she refused to accept. He remembered her back in college. She had been untouchable, one of those people who burned so brightly you assumed they'd never fall. And now she was here. He ran a hand over his face, frustrated. He hadn't seen her in over a decade, and yet something about this, about her, was cutting too deep. By the time Ethan woke, the sun had barely started to rise. His first thought was Isabel. Had she slept? Had she tried to leave? He pulled on a sweater and stepped out into the hall. The apartment was quiet, except for the soft sounds of muffled giggles coming from the guest suite. Curious, he followed the sound and stopped at the door. Inside, Harper and Hazel sat on the floor, giggling as they played with the plush blankets, their small hands running over the soft fabric like it was the most magical thing they had ever felt. Isabel sat nearby, watching them with tired eyes but a small, lingering smile. Ethan leaned against the doorframe, his chest tightening at the sight. Harper noticed him first. "Mr. Ethan?" she chirped, clumsily trying to stand. Ethan grinned. "Hey, kiddo." Harper ran toward him, crashing into his leg and wrapping her arms around it before peering up at him with wide, curious eyes. "Do you live in a castle?" Ethan chuckled. "Something like that." Isabel's smile vanished. She stood quickly, brushing herself off. "Girls, don't bother him." Harper pouted. "We're not bothering. We're playing." Hazel, the quieter of the two, finally spoke. It's really warm here. Ethan's throat tightened at the simple statement. God. These kids had been freezing for who knew how long. He crouched down, meeting Hazel's shy gaze. It'll always be warm here. She studied him carefully, as if trying to decide whether or not she could believe that. Isabel cleared her throat. We should get going. Ethan straightened. You're not going anywhere. Her jaw tightened. Ethan, I appreciate... No, you don't. His voice was calm, but firm. And that's fine. But I'm not letting you walk out of here with them until I know you have a real plan. Isabel's hands clenched into fists. I won't be your charity case. Then don't be. Ethan's voice was softer now, but no less determined. Stay. Get back on your feet. Then leave when you're actually ready. Isabel hesitated. And for the first time, Ethan saw something flicker in her eyes that looked a hell of a lot like hope. Isabel stared at Ethan, her fists clenched at her sides. She could feel the weight of his words settling in, pressing against her carefully built walls. Stay. Get back on your feet. Then leave when you're actually ready. It should have sounded reasonable. It should have made sense. But something inside her recoiled at the idea. She had learned, the hard way, that nothing in life came free. Even kindness had strings. You don't understand, she murmured, shaking her head. Ethan crossed his arms, his stance unmovable. Then explain it to me. Isabel let out a humorless laugh. You're offering me a life I don't belong in. His jaw tightened. Isabel, this isn't about belonging. It's about making sure you and the girls don't end up back on the street. She bristled. I've survived before. That's not the same as living. She looked away, her fingers tightening around the hem of the oversized sweater she had borrowed from the guest closet. It still smelled like lavender and something faintly expensive, a scent she didn't belong wrapped in. Ethan sighed, raking a hand through his hair. Look, I'm not asking for anything in return. No expectations. No conditions. Isabel scoffed. Everyone has conditions. Something flickered in his eyes, something almost wounded, but it was gone too quickly for her to be sure. Harper and Hazel had fallen into a fit of giggles again, Harper tugging on the plush duvet as if she were a princess in a fairy tale. A fairy tale. That's what this felt like. And Isabel had stopped believing in those a long time ago. She turned back to Ethan, squaring her shoulders. 1 week? His brows lifted. 1 week? That's all I need. Then we'll leave. Ethan studied her for a long moment, his gaze searching. Then finally he gave a small nod. Fine. 1 week. But the way he said it, as if he knew she'd never make it out the door by then, made her stomach twist. The next few days were a battle against discomfort and quiet gratitude. Ethan had left for work early that morning, leaving Isabel alone in the penthouse with Martha and the girls. The older woman had made French toast drizzled with maple syrup, and Isabel had nearly cried when Harper and Hazel ate without hesitation, no longer afraid the food might be taken away. Martha sat across from Isabel as the girls finished their breakfast, sipping her tea with a knowing expression. You keep looking at the door, she said after a moment. Isabel stiffened. What? Martha set her cup down. Like you're waiting for the right moment to bolt. Isabel swallowed hard, staring down at her plate. It's just a lot. Martha nodded, unsurprised. Ethan has always had a habit of throwing people into the deep end. That made Isabel look up. Has he done this before? Martha's lips twitched. That's what makes this so interesting. Isabel frowned. He's just helping. Martha tilted her head slightly. Maybe. Something about the way she said it made Isabel's stomach flutter with unease, or something else. She quickly shook the feeling away, focusing on her fork. It's temporary. Martha sipped her tea again. If you say so. Ethan returned later than expected, stepping through the penthouse doors just as the city lights flickered against the glass. He had expected silence, the way his home always felt after a long day. Instead, he heard laughter. He followed the sound to the living room, where Isabel sat on the floor with Harper and Hazel, helping them build some elaborate tower of wooden blocks. For a moment he just watched. Isabel had always been beautiful. But there was something about the way she looked right now, her guard down, her lips soft with an almost smile as she listened to Harper's rambling story, that made his chest tighten. She looked like a mother, a woman who had once dreamed of something more than survival, a woman who had been forced to fight for too long. Hazel was the first to notice him. She turned, blinking up at him with the same curious gaze she always had. "Mr. Ethan?" she said softly. Isabel's head snapped up, eyes widening slightly when she realized he was standing there. For a second they just stared at each other, the air between them heavier than before. Ethan cleared his throat. "I didn't mean to interrupt." Isabel quickly stood, brushing off her jeans. "We were just keeping busy." He nodded, stepping further into the room. The tension was still there, lingering somewhere between gratitude and something more. Harper tugged at Ethan's sleeve. "Mr. Ethan, do you know how to build castles?" His lips twitched. "I might have an idea." The next few minutes were spent in a chaotic, messy attempt to build a wooden fortress, and somehow Ethan found himself laughing. He didn't laugh. Not like this. Not since. He glanced at Isabel. She was watching him. Not with suspicion, not with wariness, just watching. And for the first time since she had stepped into his world, he wondered if she was starting to see him differently too. But the question, the one he hadn't dared to ask yet, still hovered in the air between them. Would 1 week really be enough? Ethan hadn't realized how quickly his penthouse had changed until he walked into the kitchen the next morning. It wasn't just that Martha was humming while flipping pancakes, or that the scent of fresh coffee and syrup filled the air. It was the laughter. Harper and Hazel were seated at the long marble island, swinging their little legs as they giggled over something Isabel had whispered between them. Isabel stood by the stove, holding a cup of coffee, her hair loosely tied back. She looked relaxed, at least until she saw him. The moment she caught sight of Ethan, her expression shifted. The walls went back up, her spine straightened, and she quickly busied herself adjusting Harper's fork like it was the most important task in the world. Ethan sighed inwardly. So much for progress. "Morning," he greeted, stepping forward. Martha handed him a cup of coffee, barely sparing him a glance as she continued cooking. "You're late. They already started eating." Harper grinned at him, syrup smeared on her cheek. "Martha makes the best pancakes ever." Martha chuckled. "That's because they've never had to taste yours, Mr. Caldwell." Isabel let out a small, surprised laugh before quickly covering her mouth. Ethan smirked. "That bad, huh?" Martha lifted a brow. "Last time you tried, the fire alarm went off." Harper gasped dramatically. "You almost set the castle on fire?" Ethan shot Martha a look. "Way to ruin my reputation, Martha." Isabel shook her head, pressing her lips together, but he caught the way her shoulders relaxed just a little. Good. He'd take the small victories. Once breakfast was finished, Isabel helped clean up, refusing to let Martha do everything on her own. Ethan watched from the doorway, his arms crossed. She was trying to find a place in a world that wasn't hers, in a space that didn't belong to her. And it made something deep in his chest ache. When the dishes were done, and Martha had taken the girls to the playroom, Ethan finally spoke. "You don't have to do that, you know." Isabel dried her hands on a dish towel. Do what? Act like you owe me something. She stiffened. I do. He stepped forward, his voice softer. No, you don't. She didn't respond right away. Instead, she folded the towel with careful precision, avoiding his gaze. 1 week, Ethan. That was the deal. Ethan leaned against the counter. What happens after that? Her hands tightened around the fabric. I find a job, a real one. I save money. I get us a place of our own. Ethan studied her. And how are you planning to do that? She lifted her chin, eyes flashing. I'll figure it out. Of course she would say that. Ethan had seen people like Isabel before, proud, fiercely independent, determined to claw their way back, even if it killed them, and he admired that about her. But it didn't mean he was going to let her struggle for the sake of proving a point. I have an opening at my company. That got her attention. She blinked. What? It's a position in my executive office. Administrative assistant. She let out a small laugh, shaking her head. Ethan, you don't have to do this. I know. Then why? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he let the silence stretch between them before finally saying, because I think you deserve the chance to start over. On your own terms. She swallowed hard. For a moment, he thought she might actually say yes. But then, she stepped back. I can't. Ethan's jaw tightened. Why not? She exhaled, looking away. Because it's your company. And? She bit her lip, struggling for words. And people will think you're just giving me a job out of pity. Ethan let out a frustrated breath. You think I'd put someone in my office if they weren't qualified? She hesitated. This isn't charity, Isabel. It's a real job. One that pays well with benefits. A chance to give your girls stability. Her expression wavered. He pushed just a little more. If you don't want my help, fine. But don't say no just because of your pride. Isabel flinched. And for a second, Ethan thought he'd gone too far. But then, she took a slow breath. I'll think about it. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either. Ethan nodded. Good. Then he turned, heading toward his office. And for the first time in a long time, he found himself hoping she'd stay. Isabel spent the rest of the day pretending Ethan's job offer wasn't gnawing at her. She told herself it was too much, too risky, too complicated. She had learned the hard way that accepting help often came with invisible chains. And working for Ethan Caldwell? That was a chain she wasn't ready to wear. But despite her best efforts to ignore it, the thought lingered. She stood at the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, staring at the Manhattan skyline that stretched out before her. From up here, the city looked smaller, almost manageable. But she knew better. Down there in the real world, she had spent nights sleeping in shelters that smelled of sweat and despair. She had stood in food bank lines, praying there would be enough left for her girls by the time it was her turn. Isabel stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the city below, lost in thought. From here, New York looked almost peaceful, a sea of lights twinkling against the dark sky. But she knew the truth. Down there, she had been invisible. A nameless woman with 2 hungry children, scraping by on the kindness of strangers who barely spared her a second glance. And now? Now she was standing in a billionaire's penthouse, wrapped in warmth, her daughters sleeping in soft beds. It felt surreal, like a dream she'd wake up from at any moment. But she wasn't fooled. This wasn't her world. It never had been. And Ethan Caldwell was making it dangerously easy to forget that. She exhaled, Ethan's job offer still weighing heavy on her mind. It was everything she should want. A real job, real money, a chance to build something for Harper and Hazel. But that meant stepping into his orbit completely, and she wasn't sure she could survive that. Because getting too close to Ethan, to his world, his life, to the way he looked at her sometimes, like he saw straight through her defenses, was too much. And yet, a small part of her wondered, what if? The next morning, Isabel woke up to the soft hum of voices from the living room. She slipped out of bed, careful not to wake the twins, and followed the sound. When she reached the hallway, she stopped. Ethan was standing near the fireplace, his phone pressed to his ear. His voice was calm but clipped, controlled in the way only powerful men spoke. She shouldn't have listened, but something about the sharpness in his tone made her pause. No, James. I don't care what the board says. That contract is mine. I built this company. They'll have to pry it out of my damn hands. Isabel frowned. James? She vaguely remembered the name from the business world. James Kensington, Ethan's rival. I don't need another lecture on public perception, Ethan continued, his jaw tight. You're worried about optics? Then tell them to stop leaking stories about me to the press. Her stomach clenched. Was this about her? Ethan exhaled sharply, dragging a hand through his hair. Yeah, I'm handling it. Isabel quickly stepped back into the hallway before he could see her. She leaned against the wall, her chest tightening. She wasn't naive. She knew exactly how people would see this. Billionaire takes in homeless woman and her kids. They'd call her a gold digger, a user, a charity case. And Ethan? He'd be criticized for letting emotion cloud his judgment. Isabel swallowed hard, a familiar shame crawling up her spine. She should have left already. She should have said no. Because no matter how kind Ethan was, no matter how much he claimed he was just helping, it was only a matter of time before the world twisted this into something ugly. She turned and slipped back into the guest room, pretending she had never heard a thing. Later that afternoon, Isabel found herself in the library, flipping through one of the countless books stacked on the shelves. Ethan walked in, pausing when he saw her. Didn't take you for a Jane Austen fan. She smirked slightly, closing the book. Pride and Prejudice. Classic Ethan leaned against the bookshelf, studying her. You should take the job. Isabel sighed. Not this again. You need it. She turned to face him fully. And you need to stop fixing things that aren't yours to fix. He tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. That's what you think I'm doing? Isn't it? His jaw clenched. I offered because you're smart. Because you deserve more than barely scraping by. Her throat tightened. And what happens when people start talking? When they say I'm only here because you feel guilty? Ethan took a slow step forward. I don't give a damn what people say. She let out a bitter laugh. Maybe you don't, but I do. Silence stretched between them. And then, he reached out. Not to touch her, not quite, just a fraction of space between them, like he was waiting to see if she'd pull away. She didn't. Her breath caught. For the first time since she'd arrived, she let herself really look at him, the sharp angles of his face, the way his blue eyes softened when he looked at her. This was dangerous. This was too much. And yet, for one reckless second, she let herself wonder, what would happen if she didn't walk away? Then Harper's voice rang from the hallway. Mommy! Isabel stepped back so fast it felt like gravity had shifted. Ethan's gaze darkened, but he didn't move closer. He didn't have to. The moment was already too much. Harper burst into the room, grinning. Martha made cookies. Isabel swallowed hard, forcing a smile. Then we'd better hurry before they're gone. Harper grabbed her hand and pulled her away, and Isabel let her. But as she walked out of the library, she could still feel Ethan's eyes on her, as if he was seeing through every wall she was trying to rebuild. And for the first time, she wasn't sure she wanted to put them back up. Isabel lay awake long after the penthouse had gone quiet. The city lights stretched far beyond the glass windows, a world just out of reach. She should have felt grateful, safe. But instead, her mind churned with unease, tangled in thoughts she couldn't escape. Ethan. The way he had looked at her in the library. The way his voice had softened when he told her she deserved more. The way she had almost let herself believe him. She sighed, running a hand over her face. She knew better than this. Hope was dangerous. Hope was a liar. The last time she had believed in something, it had been Jake whispering promises in her ear, telling her he'd take care of everything, that they'd figure it out together. Then he had walked away, leaving her pregnant, alone, and desperate. She had learned then that people always left. Ethan was different, she told herself. But wasn't that what she had thought before? Wasn't that what she had told herself about Jake, about her family, about every single person who had turned their back on her when she had needed them most? Isabel swallowed hard. She couldn't afford to get comfortable here, not when everything could be taken from her again. 1 week. That had been the deal, and no matter how much her heart betrayed her, she had to find a way to keep it. The next morning, Martha was in the kitchen humming as she arranged a tray of fresh fruit and toast for breakfast. Isabel sat at the counter, pretending her entire world hadn't shifted the night before. Harper and Hazel giggled over their orange juice, their little feet swinging from their stools as they happily chatted about the cookies they had eaten the night before. It was too easy to watch them here to let her guard down just a little. Then Ethan walked in. His presence filled the room instantly, though he didn't say anything at first. He was dressed more casually than usual, a crisp white shirt, dark jeans, and a wristwatch that probably cost more than everything she had ever owned combined. But it wasn't his wealth that rattled her. It was the way he looked at her. Like he was still thinking about last night. Like he could still feel the tension that had crackled between them. Isabel forced herself to clear her throat, reaching for her coffee. "Good morning." Ethan leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. "Morning." Harper grinned at him. "Guess what?" Ethan smirked. "What?" "We get to go to the bookstore today." Isabel blinked. Martha turned from where she was arranging plates. "I thought it would be nice for the girls to pick out a book of their own." Isabel hesitated. "That's not necessary." Ethan cut her off. "They should have books." Her jaw tightened. "Ethan, it's just books, Isabel." Her stomach twisted. He didn't understand. It was never just anything. She was still trying to form a response when Ethan turned his gaze on her fully. "Come with us." Her lips parted. "What?" "Come with us to the bookstore." She hesitated, torn. It was a simple request. A normal day. But nothing about this situation was normal. Still, Harper and Hazel's bright, excited faces made it impossible to say no, so she didn't. Okay. The bookstore was nestled in a cozy corner of the city, warm and inviting, with soft music playing from overhead speakers and the scent of fresh coffee and paper filling the air. Isabel had always loved bookstores. Back when she was younger, when life had been simpler, she had spent hours tucked into corners, losing herself in pages and possibilities. She hadn't stepped into one in years. And now, here she was, with her daughters running through the aisles, laughing as they traced their fingers over the colorful covers. It felt surreal. Harper tugged on Ethan's hand. "Can we pick two?" Ethan crouched down, smirking. "You can pick as many as you want." Isabel bristled. "One," she corrected, shooting Ethan a look. He smirked but didn't argue. Hazel clung to Isabel's side, pointing at a fairy tale book with golden edges. Isabel picked it up, running her fingers over the cover. "You like this one?" Hazel nodded eagerly. Ethan, standing behind her, tilted his head slightly as he studied them. "You used to love reading." Isabel turned, caught off guard. What? Ethan's expression was unreadable. Back in college. I remember seeing you in the library all the time. She blinked. She hadn't even realized he had noticed her back then. That was a long time ago. Ethan's eyes softened. It doesn't have to be. Her throat tightened. He said things so easily, like the past could be rewritten, like the years of struggle hadn't changed her. Before she could respond, Harper ran up, waving a book in the air. Can we get this one too? Isabel sighed. Fine. Ethan smirked. You're really bad at saying no to them. She shot him a glare, but he just grinned, like he had won something. And the terrifying part? She wasn't sure she wanted him to lose. That night, after the girls had fallen asleep, Isabel wandered onto the penthouse balcony. The air was cool, the city buzzing beneath her. She had barely been standing there for a minute when she felt Ethan's presence behind her. You're thinking about leaving. She exhaled. I have to. Ethan stepped closer, his voice quieter now. Why? She gripped the railing. Because staying would mean wanting more. Ethan's jaw tightened. And what's so wrong with that? She turned to him, her heart hammering. Because wanting more means getting hurt when it's taken away. The words hung between them, heavy with unspoken things. For the longest time, Ethan just watched her, his expression unreadable. Then, finally, he said the one thing that terrified her the most. What if I don't walk away? And for the first time, Isabel didn't have an answer. Isabel wasn't sure how long she stood there, staring at Ethan, his words still hanging between them. What if I don't walk away? She should have told him it didn't matter, that it changed nothing. But it did, and that terrified her. She turned back toward the city lights, gripping the cool metal of the balcony railing. Ethan, don't make promises you can't keep. He stepped closer, his warmth at her back. I don't make promises lightly. She closed her eyes. Don't believe him. Don't let yourself believe. She had learned to live with disappointment, with people who said they cared but left anyway. Ethan was different, yes, but even he had limits. He was a billionaire. She was a woman who had begged for scraps to feed her children. They weren't meant to exist in the same world. And yet, she wanted to believe him. She exhaled sharply. We should go inside. For a second, he didn't move. Then, slowly, he nodded. Okay. But as she walked past him, her arm barely brushing his, she knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The next day started normally enough. Isabel woke early, helping Martha with breakfast, while Harper and Hazel played with their coloring books at the kitchen island. Ethan had already left for work, which was a relief and a disappointment all at once. She spent the morning avoiding thoughts of him, focusing instead on job listings. But none of them paid enough. None of them offered the stability she needed. She knew the best option, the one staring her in the face, Ethan's job. But taking it meant accepting more than just employment. It meant stepping into his world, and she wasn't sure she was ready for that. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of Martha clucking her tongue in disapproval from the hallway. What in the world? Isabel turned. Martha was standing by the front door holding a thin envelope with no return address. Her gut clenched. What is it? Martha handed it to her with a frown. It was slipped under the door. A chill crept up Isabel's spine. No one knew she was here. No one was supposed to know. Hands slightly unsteady, she opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the message printed in bold black letters. You can't hide forever. Isabel's breath hitched. The floor felt like it had tilted beneath her. No, this wasn't happening. Not again. Her fingers curled around the paper as dread pooled in her stomach. Martha stepped closer, her expression sharp with concern. "What is it, dear?" Isabel quickly folded the note, stuffing it into the pocket of her sweater. "Nothing. Junk mail." Martha didn't look convinced, but she didn't push. Isabel forced herself to smile. "I'm going to take the girls to the park." She needed air. She needed to think. And most of all, she needed to figure out how to make sure her past didn't destroy the fragile stability she had found here. The playground was full of life, kids laughing, parents chatting, the crisp fall air filled with the scent of coffee from the nearby cafe. Harper and Hazel ran ahead, their giggles piercing through Isabel's haze of anxiety. She tried to focus on them, on the simple joy of their happiness, but she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. Her gaze darted around the park, scanning the faces. No one stood out. And yet, the feeling remained. She exhaled shakily, pulling her coat tighter around her. Then she heard it. A voice she never wanted to hear again. "I'll admit, I didn't expect to find you here." Her body went rigid. She turned slowly. Jake Thornton stood a few feet away, dressed in an expensive suit, looking every bit the man who had walked away from her without a second thought. Her stomach twisted. "What are you doing here?" she whispered. He smirked. "I could ask you the same thing." Her pulse pounded in her ears. No, this wasn't happening. Jake's gaze flicked toward the twins, still playing, unaware of his presence, his daughters. Her breath came shallow and fast. She stepped in front of his line of sight. "You don't get to be here." His smirk didn't waver. "Come on, Isabel. That's not very friendly." She clenched her jaw. "You don't get to waltz back into our lives after abandoning us." His eyes darkened slightly, but the amusement remained. "I didn't abandon anyone. You made your choices." Her nails dug into her palms. "Get out." Jake's smile dropped. "I heard you've been staying with Caldwell." A cold sweat broke out on her skin. So that's why he was here. Ethan's name had always carried weight, power. If Jake knew about him, he thought she was a problem he needed to fix. He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping. "Don't get too comfortable, Isabel. You're still the same girl who got left behind." Her vision blurred with fury. Before she could stop herself, she stepped forward. "Stay the hell away from us." Jake chuckled, stepping back with mock surrender. "Relax, just checking in." His gaze flickered toward the penthouse in the distance. He was watching. He knew. And that terrified her more than anything. With one last smirk, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowded street. Isabel sucked in a shaky breath, her entire body trembling. She had fought so hard to keep Jake out of their lives, and now she had no idea how to stop him. By the time Isabel and the girls returned to the penthouse, her stomach was twisted in knots. She needed to pack their things, get out before Jake made things worse. But the moment she stepped inside, Ethan was there. His eyes locked on hers, immediately sensing something was wrong. "What happened?" She hesitated. She should lie. She should keep it to herself. But the memory of Jake's voice, of his warning, wouldn't leave her. Ethan took another step forward, his voice low. "Isabel, tell me." She swallowed hard. And then finally, she whispered the words that made everything real. "Jake found us." Ethan's entire body went rigid. "Jake found you?" His voice was dangerously low, the kind of quiet that preceded a storm. Isabel wrapped her arms around herself, nodding slowly. Ethan exhaled sharply, pacing toward the window, his jaw tight. "Tell me exactly what happened." She swallowed, trying to steady her breath. "I took the girls to the park. I didn't see him at first, but he was watching us. He knew I was here, Ethan. He knew I was staying with you." Ethan turned back to her sharply. "How?" She shook her head, panic rising. "I don't know, but he said he was checking in." She let out a bitter laugh. "As if he ever cared before." Ethan clenched his fists. "And the note?" Her stomach tightened. He knew about that too. Slowly, she reached into her pocket, pulling out the crumpled piece of paper. She hesitated before handing it to him. Ethan smoothed it out, his expression growing even darker as he read the bold, chilling words. "You can't hide forever." For a moment, silence hung thick in the air. Then, Ethan grabbed his phone. "What are you doing?" Isabel's voice was sharp with alarm. "Calling my security team." She stepped forward, grabbing his wrist. "No." Ethan narrowed his eyes. "No?" She took a shaky breath. "I don't want this turning into something worse." His voice dropped. "Jake is already making it worse." Isabel's grip tightened. "Please, let me handle this." Ethan looked at her for a long moment, his blue eyes searching hers. "Isabel, you can't fix this alone." She flinched, because she knew he was right. For years she had only relied on herself, because there had never been anyone else. Now Ethan was standing in front of her, offering to be the one person who wouldn't leave. And she didn't know how to accept that. Finally, Ethan exhaled, raking a hand through his hair. "Fine. But if he comes near you or the girls again, I handle it my way." She nodded, not trusting herself to speak, because she had the sinking feeling that Jake wasn't done yet. Not even close. That night, Isabel lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her mind spinning. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Jake's smirk, his cold eyes, his voice curling with arrogance. She hated how he could still make her feel small. She hated even more that she felt safer here than she had in years. That terrified her, because nothing safe ever lasted. She turned on her side, exhaling shakily. Across the room, Harper and Hazel were curled together in the big bed, their soft breaths steady. For them, she would do anything. Even if that meant trusting Ethan more than she trusted herself. By the time Isabel made it to the kitchen, Ethan was already dressed for the day, a crisp black suit, his tie loosened slightly as he sipped his coffee. He looked up when she walked in. "How'd you sleep?" She hesitated before answering. "Fine." He raised a brow, clearly not believing her. "Liar." She let out a breath. "I didn't sleep." Ethan's expression softened. "I didn't either." That admission startled her. "Because of Jake?" He shrugged, setting his mug down. "Because of a lot of things." Their eyes met across the room, something unspoken stretching between them. Isabel looked away first. "About the job," she said, forcing the words out before she could change her mind. "I'll take it." Ethan straightened slightly. "You will?" She nodded, suddenly nervous. "Yes, but only because I need it. Not because you're trying to save me." A slow, knowing smile spread across Ethan's face. "Of course." Isabel rolled her eyes. "I'm serious. I know." She crossed her arms. "And I'm not taking special treatment. If I work for you, I'm going to earn it." Ethan's smile softened. "You already have." Something tightened in her chest. Because the way he said that, the way he looked at her like she was worth something again, it was almost too much. Dangerous. But she couldn't turn back now. She just had to hope that accepting his help didn't cost her more than she was willing to lose. The morning felt different. As Isabel stood in front of the floor-length mirror in the guest bedroom, adjusting the sleek navy blouse Martha had loaned her, she barely recognized herself. For the first time in years, she wasn't waking up wondering where their next meal would come from, or if tonight would be another night on the streets. Instead, she was starting a job. A real job. One that paid well, one that meant she could save for an apartment, for the life she had promised Harper and Hazel. But with the excitement came fear. the gnawing anxiety that whispered, "What if you fail?" Taking a deep breath, she pushed the doubt away and turned to find the girls already dressed, Hazel carefully buttoning her tiny coat while Harper tried to tie her own shoes. They looked so happy, so full of energy, like this was just another day, like their world hadn't been flipped upside down. Isabel smiled, kneeling down to help Harper with the laces. "Are you excited to go to daycare?" Hazel nodded eagerly. "Martha says they have story time." Harper clapped her hands. "And a playhouse." Isabel's chest ached with quiet relief. They didn't know how hard she was fighting to make sure they never went back to where they had been. She kissed each of their foreheads. "You're going to have so much fun," Harper grinned. "And you're going to work with Mr. Ethan?" Isabel's stomach twisted slightly. Yes, she was. And that fact alone felt just as terrifying as it did hopeful. Ethan was already waiting in the sleek black SUV when Isabel stepped out of the penthouse with the girls. He was dressed in a charcoal gray suit, perfectly tailored, his hair styled effortlessly. He looked every bit the billionaire he was. Unreachable, untouchable. And yet, when he turned toward them, a slow smile tugged at his lips. "Ready?" Isabel forced herself to nod. "As I'll ever be." The ride to his company's headquarters was surprisingly easy, filled with Harper and Hazel's chatter about daycare and Martha's stories about working for Mr. Ethan. Isabel found herself relaxing just a little, until they pulled up to Caldwell Industries. The glass skyscraper loomed above them, an imposing testament to Ethan's empire. Isabel had known he was successful, but seeing it like this? It was overwhelming. Ethan stepped out first, buttoning his suit jacket with an air of effortless confidence. Isabel hesitated, gripping her bag. "I don't belong here." Ethan turned, his expression firm. "Yes, you do." Before she could argue, Harper's tiny hand tugged on hers. "Mommy, you got this." Her heart squeezed. She swallowed hard and took a deep breath. "Okay." With one last glance at Ethan, she stepped forward, and into a world she never thought she'd be part of. Isabel had expected whispers. She hadn't expected full-blown stares. The moment she walked into the office, people turned, curious, judging, whispering. She could hear it even without listening. "Is that her? The woman Mr. Caldwell took in? Why is she here?" Her hands curled into fists, but she kept her head high. She was here to work, not to be a story for bored executives. Ethan walked beside her, unbothered, as if he didn't notice, or more likely he didn't care. They reached his executive floor, where a sharp-looking woman with dark-framed glasses and a no-nonsense expression greeted them. "Mr. Caldwell." Ms. Monroe Isabel stiffened. She knew her name? The woman barely blinked as she handed Isabel a tablet. "I'm Rachel. I manage this floor. Your workstation is just outside Mr. Caldwell's office." Isabel nodded. "Thank you." Rachel hesitated, lowering her voice slightly. "Just ignore the rumors. They'll move on to something else soon enough." That was unexpected. Rachel gave a small, almost reassuring smile before disappearing down the hall. Isabel let out a slow breath. At least not everyone was against her. She turned to Ethan. "So, what exactly does an assistant to a billionaire do?" Ethan smirked. "You'll find out soon enough." And with that, he led her into his office. The morning flew by. Ethan wasn't easy to work for. He was sharp, impossibly intelligent, and expected everything done before he even asked for it. But Isabel wasn't intimidated. She was good at this. She picked up on things fast. She asked the right questions. By noon, she had already handled 3 meeting schedules, an investor call, and a full inbox of urgent messages. Ethan glanced at her from his desk. "Not bad for your first day." She arched a brow. Was that a compliment? He smirked. A rare one. Don't get used to it. Before she could respond, his intercom buzzed. Mr. Caldwell, James Kensington is here. Isabel froze. Ethan's expression darkened. Send him in. A moment later, a man stepped into the office. James Kensington, tall, well-dressed, charismatic in the way only dangerous men were. And when his gaze landed on Isabel, something flickered in his expression. Interest. Well, well, James murmured, stepping forward. So this is the infamous Isabel Monroe. Ethan's entire body tensed beside her. Isabel forced herself to stay calm. She knew men like James. They played with power like it was a game. James tilted his head. I have to admit, I didn't expect her to be quite so charming. Ethan's voice was like steel. James! James smirked. Relax, Caldwell. I'm just introducing myself. His gaze flicked back to Isabel. Though I have to wonder, what exactly is she to you? Silence. The question hung between them, heavy. Ethan's jaw tightened. Isabel felt every eye in the room on her, and for the first time since walking through these doors, she realized something. She wasn't just fighting for a job, she was standing in the middle of a war. And Ethan Caldwell was the only thing standing between her and men like James Kensington. Ethan didn't move. His shoulders were tense, his jaw clenched, and the temperature in the office seemed to drop by several degrees. Isabel could feel it, the restrained fury beneath his calm exterior. James Kensington knew exactly what he was doing. He leaned against the edge of Ethan's desk, exuding the kind of smug confidence that only came from privilege, power, and an utter disregard for boundaries. So, Isabel. James let her name roll off his tongue as if testing it. Tell me, how does it feel to go from the streets to the top floor of Caldwell Industries? Her stomach turned. There it was, the accusation wrapped in a compliment. He wasn't asking about her work. He was questioning why she was here at all. She lifted her chin, keeping her voice steady. I work here, Mr. Kensington, just like everyone else. James chuckled, glancing at Ethan. Is that right? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like something else entirely. Ethan's voice was like ice. Careful, James. James smirked. Or what? You'll throw me out of your office? Ethan didn't answer, but the dangerous glint in his eyes was enough of a warning. James, apparently satisfied that he'd poked the bear, pushed off the desk and straightened his cuffs. Relax, old friend. He smirked. I'm just making conversation. You know how the board gets when rumors start floating. Ethan didn't blink. Then tell them to keep their noses out of my business. James let out a low laugh. Oh, Ethan. But you are the business. His gaze flickered to Isabel one last time before he turned toward the door. I'll see you both soon. Something tells me this story is just getting started. With that, he strolled out, his presence leaving a bitter taste in the air. The moment the door closed, Isabel let out a shaky breath. Ethan exhaled sharply, pressing his palms against the desk. I hate that guy. I noticed. He ran a hand through his hair, his frustration barely contained. Are you okay? She crossed her arms. Should I be? He looked at her then, really looked at her, and something flickered in his expression. She wasn't afraid. She was angry, and Ethan hadn't expected that. I don't like people making assumptions about me, she said, voice tight. And I really don't like people acting like I don't deserve to be here. Ethan stepped closer, his voice softer now. You do deserve to be here. She let out a small laugh. Tell that to your friend. His jaw tightened. James isn't my friend. Isabel sighed, rubbing a hand over her forehead. This is exactly why I didn't want to take this job. Because of men like him? Because of men like you. Ethan stilled. What does that mean? She exhaled, shaking her head. I appreciate what you've done for me, for the girls. But the truth is, you live in a world where people like James make the rules. And She hesitated, looking away. I don't. Ethan took another step forward, closing the space between them. Then let's rewrite the rules. Her breath caught. He said things so easily, as if power was something you could bend at will. And maybe for him, it was. But for her? She had spent years being powerless, and she wasn't sure she was ready to trust someone else to hold that power for her. Ethan. He reached for her hand before she could pull away. His touch was warm, grounding, and far too dangerous. Let me protect you, Isabel. His voice was low, almost pleading. I don't care what James or anyone else says. You belong here, with me. Her heart stuttered painfully in her chest, because for a second, just a second, she wanted to believe him. But the past had already taught her that believing in men like Ethan Caldwell was how you got burned. She pulled her hand away, ignoring the flash of disappointment in his eyes. I need to get back to work. Ethan hesitated, as if he wanted to say something more. But in the end, he just nodded. And as Isabel turned away, she knew whatever was building between them was getting harder to ignore. And she wasn't sure she had the strength to keep fighting it. The tension between Isabel and Ethan didn't fade after James left. If anything, it settled into something heavier, something unspoken that neither of them seemed willing to confront. She buried herself in work, ignoring the occasional curious glances from the staff as she learned the ins and outs of her new role. Ethan, for his part, was distant, but not in the way she expected. He wasn't cold or dismissive. If anything, he watched her more, like he was waiting. And Isabel wasn't sure if she was more afraid of him waiting for her to accept his help, or for her to accept something far more dangerous, something neither of them was ready to name. The day was winding down when Isabel got the text from Martha. Martha, we have a problem. He's here. Isabel's blood ran cold. He? She grabbed her phone and hurried toward the elevator, her pulse hammering. By the time she reached the penthouse, she knew exactly who she was going to find. Jake Thornton stood in the living room, a smirk on his face, his hands tucked casually in the pockets of his tailored suit. Harper and Hazel sat on the couch, their small bodies tense, their eyes darting between him and Martha, who stood stiffly beside them, arms crossed. The moment Hazel saw Isabel, she scrambled off the couch and ran straight into her arms. Isabel caught her, heart pounding, holding her daughter close as she glared at the man who had once called himself their father. Get out. Jake chuckled, shaking his head. Is that any way to greet me? Isabel's hands clenched into fists. I said, get out. He sighed, his smirk never fading. Relax. I'm just here to talk. She didn't believe him for a second. You lost the right to talk to me the day you walked away. Jake tilted his head, his eyes flickering toward Hazel, who clung to Isabel's side. I didn't walk away. You made a choice, one that cost you everything. Rage coiled in her chest. I made the choice to have my daughters, Jake, and you made the choice to abandon them. Something flashed in his expression. Annoyance, maybe, or frustration that she wasn't bowing to him like she once had. You should be thanking me, he said smoothly. If I had stayed, do you really think your life would have been any better? Isabel's breath caught. He wasn't just trying to manipulate her. He was trying to make her doubt herself, the way he always had. Before she could respond, the front door opened again. And then Ethan was there. The entire room shifted. Jake turned, his smirk faltering slightly as Ethan strode forward, his presence crackling with restrained fury. What the hell are you doing in my home? Jake smiled, but it was thinner now, stretched tight over his perfect polished mask. Ah, the knight in shining armor. He turned back to Isabel. "I see you landed on your feet after all." Ethan took another step forward, his voice dangerously low. "You have 10 seconds to leave before I throw you out myself." Jake exhaled, rolling his eyes. Always so dramatic, Caldwell. But he must have seen the deadly promise in Ethan's eyes, because he lifted his hands in mock surrender and stepped toward the door. Before he left, he turned back to Isabel, his expression unreadable. "We'll talk again soon." Then he was gone. The moment the door shut, Isabel sagged against the wall, Hazel still clinging to her side. Ethan turned to her, his voice softer now. "Are you okay?" She let out a shaky breath. "No." She wasn't. She was furious. Furious that Jake had found them. Furious that he still had the power to shake her. But more than anything, she was furious at herself. Because for all her insistence that she could handle things alone, when she had seen Ethan standing there, her first instinct had been relief. Relief that she wasn't alone anymore. Later that night, after the girls had fallen asleep, Isabel stood on the balcony, staring at the city below. Ethan joined her after a few minutes, silent as he leaned against the railing beside her. She didn't look at him when she spoke. "I don't know how he found me." Ethan's jaw tightened. "I'll find out." She exhaled, her breath shaky. "I don't want him near them, Ethan." His voice was steel. "He won't be." Silence stretched between them. Finally, she turned to him. "I can't do this forever." Ethan met her gaze, something fierce and undeniable in his expression. "Do what?" "Fight alone." She hadn't meant to say it, but once the words were out, she couldn't take them back. And then Ethan was stepping closer, closing the space between them. "You don't have to." Her heart pounded. "Ethan." He reached for her hand, his fingers warm and steady against hers. "Let me in, Isabel." She swallowed hard. She wanted to. God, she wanted to. But wanting had never been the problem. The problem was what would happen when wanting turned into needing. And what would happen if Ethan Caldwell wasn't as unshakable as he seemed. Isabel hadn't let herself cry in years. Not when she was sleeping in shelters, clutching Hazel and Harper so tightly they whimpered. Not when she skipped meals so they could eat. Not even when she realized no one from her past, not her family, not her so-called friends, and definitely not Jake, was coming to help her. But now, standing on the balcony of Ethan's penthouse, with the weight of his words pressing against her, she felt dangerously close to breaking. "Let me in, Isabel." She wanted to, God, she wanted to. But letting Ethan in meant trusting him to stay. And people didn't stay. She exhaled shakily, pulling her hand back from his grasp. "I don't need saving, Ethan." He didn't look surprised. If anything, he looked frustrated. "This isn't about saving you." She let out a soft, bitter laugh. "Isn't it?" His eyes darkened. "You think I'm doing this out of pity?" She flinched. "Aren't you?" Ethan swore under his breath, stepping closer. "Isabel, I've met a lot of people in my life. Some of them wanted my money. Some wanted my power. Some wanted me to fix their lives for them." He paused, his blue eyes burning into hers. "You? You won't let me give you a damn thing." She looked away, swallowing hard. Ethan continued, his voice lower now, more controlled. "I don't want to save you. I want to stand beside you." Her breath hitched, stand beside her. Not rescue her, not own her, just be there. It was such a foreign concept that she had no idea what to do with it. Finally, she forced herself to speak. "I can't, I don't." She shook her head. "I don't know how to do this." Ethan's expression softened, but his voice remained firm. "Then let me show you." Something inside her cracked open, just a little. But before she could respond, the sound of Hazel's sleepy voice interrupted them. "Mommy?" Isabel turned instantly, seeing her daughter standing in the doorway, rubbing her eyes. She didn't hesitate. She stepped away from Ethan and scooped Hazel into her arms, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "It's okay, baby. Let's get you back to bed." She felt Ethan watching them, felt the moment slip away. But maybe that was for the best. Because despite everything, Isabel still didn't know how to let someone catch her when she had spent her entire life learning how to fall alone. The next morning, Ethan had barely walked into his office when his head of security, Greg Lawson, was waiting for him. "We have a problem," Greg said, without P. Ethan sighed. "Yeah, I figured." Greg placed a manila folder on the desk. "Jake Thornton has been digging. He's been talking to people, reporters, board members, old acquaintances of Isabel." Ethan's jaw tightened. "He's building a narrative." Greg nodded. "And not a good one." Ethan flipped the file open and scanned the contents. Jake had already planted 2 blind gossip items about Isabel, suggesting that she had manipulated her way into Ethan's life. The implications were clear, that she was using him, that she wasn't trustworthy, that she had an agenda. It was a lie, and Ethan had 0 patience for liars. "Shut it down," he ordered, snapping the file closed. Greg hesitated. "Are you sure?" "If we go after Jake, it's going to escalate." Ethan's eyes were cold and unforgiving. "Then let it escalate." Because if Jake wanted a war, he had just found the wrong opponent. Isabel knew something was wrong the moment she stepped into Ethan's office later that afternoon. His posture was tense, his fingers curled around a pen as he read through a document. He looked up when she walked in, his eyes scanning her face, assessing her. "Close the door." Her stomach twisted. "Ethan, what's going on?" He pushed the file toward her. "Jake's trying to ruin you." She blinked, her heart hammering. "What?" He leaned forward. "He's spreading stories, talking to the press. He wants to paint you as a gold digger, someone who's taking advantage of me." She swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the folder. Of course Jake was doing this, because he couldn't control her anymore, so he was going to destroy her instead. Isabel let out a shaky breath. "It doesn't matter." Ethan's expression turned furious. "Like hell it doesn't." She shook her head, gripping the edge of the desk. "Ethan, I've been called worse. I've been treated worse. This question mark, this is nothing." Ethan stood, coming around the desk. "It's not nothing to me." Her breath caught. He stopped right in front of her, his presence warm, steady, dangerous in the way that made her want to trust him. "You matter to me, Isabel." Her throat closed. She didn't know what to say to that. So she did the only thing she could. She tried to run. "I should go." She turned, reaching for the door. But Ethan caught her wrist. "Don't." She froze. Slowly she turned back. And suddenly Ethan was too close, his voice too soft, too real. "I won't let him hurt you." Tears burned at the back of her eyes, but she forced them down. "You can't fix this, Ethan." He let out a low breath. "Maybe not. But I'm not going anywhere." She swallowed hard. For a moment she let herself believe him. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away. Because if she stayed any longer, she wasn't sure she'd be able to. The city glittered below, a sea of lights stretching far into the night. Isabel stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of Ethan's penthouse, her arms wrapped around herself as she tried to silence the storm raging inside her. Jake had tried to ruin her, again. And for the first time in years, she had someone willing to fight for her. But did she want that? Could she accept it? Behind her, Ethan stood at the doorway, watching her with the quiet intensity that always unsettled her. "You're thinking about running." She flinched. "I can't stay here forever, Ethan." He exhaled slowly, stepping closer. Who said you had to? She turned, startled. What? His voice was calm but firm. You don't have to stay here, Isabel. But stop convincing yourself that leaving is the only option. Tears pricked at the back of her eyes. I don't belong in your world. He shook his head. Screw the world. This isn't about money or power. It's about us. Her breath hitched. United States. It was such a simple word. But when he said it, it felt like everything. Ethan stepped closer, closing the space between them. I know what it's like to not trust anyone, to think that if you don't handle everything yourself, it'll all fall apart. He paused, his voice softer now. But Isabel, you don't have to do it alone anymore. She swallowed hard. He made it sound so easy, like love wasn't a risk, like she wouldn't lose herself if she let him catch her. And what if it all goes wrong? She whispered. Ethan reached for her hand, his fingers warm and steady against hers. Then we'll figure it out. A tear slipped down her cheek. She had spent years being afraid of being hurt, afraid of trusting someone only to be left alone again. But Ethan had never left, not when she fought him, not when she pulled away, not even when she gave him every reason to. And suddenly, the truth became painfully clear. She didn't want to run. She didn't want to start over somewhere else, alone, fighting for survival every second of the day. She wanted this. She wanted him. A slow, shaky breath escaped her lips. Okay. Ethan frowned slightly. Okay. She nodded, finally letting herself believe in this, in him, in them. I'm tired of running. His entire body seemed to relax, like he'd been holding his breath, waiting for her to break. Then, before she could second-guess herself, he pulled her in. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, questioning. Then it deepened, a slow, consuming heat that stole the breath from her lungs. Ethan kissed her like he was making a promise. And for the first time in years, Isabel wasn't afraid to believe it. 1 year later, sunlight poured through the windows of their new home. Not Ethan's penthouse, but a beautiful brownstone in Brooklyn. A home they had chosen together. Isabel sipped her coffee, watching as Harper and Hazel ran through the backyard, their laughter ringing through the crisp autumn air. Martha was in the kitchen, humming as she baked. And Ethan? Ethan was watching her. She smiled. You're staring. He smirked. You're mine. I'm allowed to stare. Her heart fluttered, even after all this time. Because love with Ethan wasn't perfect. It was hard and messy and real. But it was the safest thing she had ever known. And for the first time in her life, Isabel wasn't afraid of wanting more. She already had it. And she was never letting go.